Oh, so
Meng is also here.
Yeah,
Meng, welcome. Theo, welcome. Okay.
Hello.
Good morning.
We're about to start. Let's take about 30 seconds, right? Hakan Hocam. Then we'll be starting.
Tamamdır hocam, başlayabilirsin.
Okay. Thank you all very much for attending this conference. It's the second international conference on school administrators. And this year's theme is the school autonomy. And we have very distinguished international speakers among us. And they will be presenting the topics to us. And I am the moderator of this session. And the first person to go would be Dr. TIAN. And I sincerely apologize if I mispronounce your names. And please correct me if I say it wrong. And then the second, Dr. Pace is going to give us a presentation. And the third one has two co-presenters, Dr. MUAHAYIMANA and Dr. SCHARES or SCHARES? How do I say that?
Yes, SCHARES, correct, thank you.
Okay. So we all have, actually total, we have 50 minutes, and this is a 50 minutes session. And each speaker would have about 12 minutes. And actually for the co-presenters, that would be 6 minutes per person. So if we can adhere to these housekeeping rules, that would be a good one. Of course, not always we can control ourselves and our speeches, but I will try to, at least remind you the time. And then we will have about 10 or 15 minutes of discussion in case our guests or the audience would like to ask any questions to the speakers, to the presenters. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. TIAN for her presentation.
Thank you so much. Is it possible for me to share my screen for the slides?
I guess you are. Let me try to do that.
Yeah, I think I can do that.
Yeah, okay. Yep, we can see your presentation.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Uma, and good afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to attend the International School Principals Conference. Whether you are attending the conference in person or online, I hope you all have a productive day. The past 18 months has reminded us of the importance of authentic interpersonal connection, which is an indispensable part of school principals' work. Hope this conference brings back some normality to us. I'm honored to share this 1 hour with brilliant scholars from the United States. I'm looking forward to your presentations and the discussion with the audience afterwards. My name is Meng. I am an associate professor in educational leadership and management based at the University of Bath, UK. Today, I have the pleasure to share my thoughts on how to distribute leadership in a time of crisis. Let's first scrutinize the concept of crisis. A crisis is defined as a time of great disagreement, confusion, or suffering that affects an individual, group, community, or the whole society. The traditional view on crisis is that it is external to us, such as natural disasters, pandemic, wars, financial collapse, and fatal accidents. We as leaders, therefore, can use our resources and agency to resolve the crisis and restore normality. This is called crisis management. The problem of separating crisis from crisis management is twofold. First, it denies the complexity of human crisis interaction and the possible mistakes people make as part of the natural learning curve. In other words, people are expected to resolve the crisis, not to be part of the crisis, which we know based on our lived experience, this is not always true. And second, most crisis management protocols and models are reactive and linear. They suggest immediate and standardized reactions without taking situational nuances, resources, emotions, and people's agency into consideration. Most of the crisis management tools provide a roadmap, a linear path with a sole focus on the crisis itself. It is assumed that by following the roadmap step by step, we will triumph. Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He analyzed many mythological narratives in history across different cultures. He found a common structure of a hero's adventure. So the hero faces the ordeal, rises up to challenge with the support of his allies, and eventually overcomes the adversity and receives a reward. When talking about leadership in a time of crisis, we hear very similar stories. There's always a visible enemy. The leader with his allies collects information, analyzes it, makes a rational but sometimes difficult decision that leads to an ideal solution and a remarkable triumph. All we need is a confident, charismatic, competent, and committed leader. But we know reality is far messier than stories. Let's take COVID as an example. This is, as the news put it, an unprecedented crisis in terms of its magnitude and impact. It took months for scientists to establish statistical models to illustrate the spread of the virus over time. And yet, on the meso and micro levels, situations remain unpredictable. Many countries entered the lockdown and schools switched to online teaching and learning. I would love to hear about the situations in your own countries, but here in the UK, it was not until October 2020 did the government publish a guidance on online education provision. That was half a year after the first lockdown. And this guidance does not provide more clarity. Instead, according to several studies, school principals and teachers felt more confused about what to do and how to keep teachers and students safe. Critical questions such as how to convert face-to-face teaching to online delivery, how are exams organized and administrated, how to support students who lack digital resources at home, how to protect teachers and students' mental health and well-being remain unanswered in that guidance. By looking at the number of cases, the UK government started a round of yo-yo policies of easing and entering lockdown several times, leaving school principals and teachers bewildered about the uncertain situation. Therefore, the romantic narrative of a heroic leader in crisis has to be flipped. What we need is getting back to the reality and understanding that leadership in a time of crisis is a learning process, not a dragon-slaying mythology. In 2016, I proposed a resource agency duality model of distributed leadership. In a nutshell, distributed leadership is about distributing resources to achieve organizational goals and activating people's agency so that they can achieve personal goals. A leader's role is to align the personal goals with the organizational ones. These can be contrasted with the performance-based leadership model that mainly, if not solely, focuses on enhancing learning outcomes. During the past 18 months, we observed that schools with a distributed leadership design appeared more resilient in front of a crisis because they have learned and practiced on how to account for and coordinate both organizational and personal needs. In comparison, when the pandemic hit all of us, schools that are used to doing everything just to deliver the desirable test results were less prepared to shift the priorities to safety, well-being, and support. When practicing distributed leadership during the COVID time, some principles highlight the following lessons. Firstly, agreeing on the core values and priorities with all school staff, students, and parents. For example, health and safety are paramount. Key decisions should be made on the basis of these key values and priorities, even it means sometimes things like time and financial resources have to be sacrificed. Secondly, as a school leader, it is necessary to admit what one knows and what one does not know. This is counterintuitive because a heroic leader is expected to know better than others in a time of crisis. However, by depicting a more realistic picture of the reality to school staff, students, and parents, actually creates a safer psychological environment. Pretending to have all the answers takes people's agency away. It also makes it more difficult for a leader to ask for support and help from the staff. Thirdly, because nobody has all the information to have a comprehensive analysis of the situation, it is necessary to see crisis management as a learning process. People should be allowed to collect information and create resources along the way. More importantly, just like learning, making mistakes is part of the crisis management process, as long as these mistakes are reflected on and corrected. If a leader does not admit to making mistakes, he or she takes that right away from the people he or she leads. Fourthly, using checkpoints to redirect resource distribution and reassess priorities. This is critical when nobody has a roadmap in a crisis. Instead, we need a compass and frequently check the directions we are taking. Fifthly, to activate people's agency so that they take ownership of the school, principals should allow people to make planned and ad hoc decisions with transparency. It is important to remember that distributed leadership is not about making everyone a leader, and transparency is not about giving everyone equal access to all the information, but it means being honest and open about the context in which the decisions are made and all the factors that have been taken into consideration. By doing so, school principals are demonstrating how to lead to the staff. So to sum up in this presentation, I want to underline that leading schools in an uncertain situation is possibly the new normal for school principals. When talking about leadership, we spend too much time on thinking about what to do and how to do it. But the major upheavals like the COVID force us to reflect on the questions of who we are and why we do things. And it is always important to remember leading a school in a crisis or in a major change is about leading people, and people have their emotions and their diverse needs. And as a leader, we do not only serve the school goals, but also the goals and dreams people carry as part of the community. Here are the references I've been using for this presentation, and yeah. So thank you very much for the time, and I am looking forward to other presentations and the discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tian. And you didn't actually. I was about to, just remind that we were running out of time, but and you were, you tailored your presentation so perfectly to time. And now it's our second presenter, Dr. Pace, and here we go.
Thank you. Are you able to see my screen and the slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Nick Pace. I serve as professor and chairperson of the Department of Educational Administration at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I want to echo what Professor Tian said about what an honor it is to participate in the conference and the conversations and the discussion. I really appreciated Professor Tian's presentation, and it's difficult to follow such a good presentation and such insight, but very happy to be here. I'm going to share with you some research that was done by faculty members here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln around principals' challenges in the state of Nebraska. It's quite a large document, and I was a member of the research team, but in a supporting role, and so I want to be clear. About that. School principals, autonomy, challenges and experiences in Nebraska, USA. So first of all, to set a bit of context, I have the state of Nebraska here outlined in red. We're very nearly in the middle of the continental United States. Sometimes this area is referred to as flyover country, as folks are on their way from one coast to the other. We don't perhaps attract the attention of many other states. However, as many likely know, Midwestern states such as Nebraska have a very strong educational reputation with typically very well-supported schools and very high-performing students. To further set some context in the state of Nebraska, the Omaha public schools are located on the eastern border of our state, and Omaha enrolls 51,914 students, which is not perhaps large by many international comparisons, but it places it among the larger districts in the USA. Within Omaha, dozens and dozens of languages are spoken, dozens of cultural traditions, very diverse in every way possible, socioeconomically, linguistically, country of origin, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. As you move west across the state of Nebraska, it's about 7 hours distance by car. And to contrast a bit, the Omaha Public Schools enroll not quite 52,000 students. The smallest P12 public school district in the state of Nebraska is here in McPherson County, and McPherson County enrolls only 61 students in kindergarten through 12th grade. So we have great variation in the state in terms of the context of the districts. I should also explain contextually that there are not quite 2 million residents of Nebraska, and 75% or so of those 2 million live in this general area concentrated here in the east. So one of the things that we see in addition to the variation in school size is some rural and urban tension in terms of education policy, in terms of tax policy, in terms of decisions that are made in the more urban centers that affect the rest of the state. And so that's a very real factor for us in Nebraska as we work with principals. There are 244 districts. Outside of the urban areas, the districts tend to be smaller in enrollment. They tend to be fairly homogeneous racially, ethnically, but within different communities, there are pockets of great ethnic diversity, even in rural areas. To set a bit more context for the study that we conducted, it was entitled Nebraska Principals Speak in 2018. And our team was commissioned by the Nebraska Department of Education to study the experiences and the perspectives of Nebraska principals. There was great interest in understanding their unique perspectives on how they do their work, what challenges they see. And there was a powerful interest at the State Department of Education to provide more support for principals rather than the Department of Education being solely a compliance agency. And so our study consisted of two components, qualitative research led by Dr. Sarah Zuckerman, who interviewed 25 principals with focus group participants from across the state. And the quantitative portion of the study was led by Dr. Jingong Jia, who adapted the 7 dimensions of integrated school leadership survey, which was developed at Western Michigan University. So we were able to explore the perspectives and experiences and needs of Nebraska principals from 2 angles, qualitatively and quantitatively. And we uncovered some things that we think are very salient, very unique to Nebraska, but also have applications to other areas and other contexts. Among the quantitative findings, rural principals reported lower levels of school leadership according to the 7 Dimensions survey, which is not to say they are inferior leaders. It's not to say they're ineffective at their jobs. One of our conclusions was, and I'm showing you the key findings here, not all of the findings from the study in the interest of time, but one of our suspicions is that because of the many hats or the many roles that rural principals occupy, they may have less time and less focus on instructional leadership or school leadership in general. They have many, many duties, and in, of course, smaller and rural settings, they have fewer levels of support or layers of support, or we might say they have great autonomy simply because there perhaps is an elementary principal and a secondary principal in the district, and those are the only administrators. Similarly, principals in combined schools also reported lower levels of school leadership according to the 7 dimensions. And there we're referring to principals who were in shared elementary and middle school buildings or shared perhaps 6th grade through 12th grade buildings. And again, our feeling and impression there was that because of the range of students, because of the range of duties, there was more complexity for those principals. We were encouraged that the survey revealed that principals reported feeling high efficacy. They also perceived that they have accessible supports in terms of instructional leadership, curriculum leadership, special education support, etc. We were encouraged by those findings, not all of which completely matched the qualitative research. Among the key qualitative findings, the principals talked extensively about emphasizing relationships and helping others succeed in a very servant leadership orientation to their jobs. They described many different visions of success. They described academic success. They described students reaching their full potential. So success was not defined by the principals in all of the same ways. We were also very interested that the principals in the qualitative research described school improvement very differently. Some saw school improvement as something related to compliance and accreditation and demonstrating to the state that they are doing what they are supposed to do or held accountable to do, while others talked about accountability from a standpoint of continuous improvement and always improving instruction and trying to create better learning environments. So there was there was a nuanced view of this is about continual improvement, and this is about justifying what we do and completing the administrative tasks. The fourth finding here was that the principals reported very uneven access to professional development and networks of support. And in the context of autonomy for principals, I think this is particularly salient because some of the principals almost gave us the impression that perhaps they had too much autonomy in terms of feeling alone or lacking access to a professional network, lacking access to a mentor. If they were the only principal in the district, who do they turn to for advice and counsel and help with some of their challenging situations? That was particularly pronounced in rural areas where there may be an hour or even 2 hours distance between districts or between school leaders, particularly in the rural areas. They also talked about similar but contextually based challenges across urban and rural schools. For example, change resistance among teachers, perhaps, or working with difficult parents and families is a similar challenge in urban and rural areas, but it's much more, it's very contextually based because of the anonymity that sometimes comes in larger centers with the relationships that are common in smaller settings. The principal sees families at the grocery store, sees families at their house of worship, perhaps, or there's much less anonymity. So the challenges and support, opportunities going forward, listening to these principles was quite interesting for us. Shortly after concluding the research, the state of Nebraska began developing and is now implementing new principal performance standards, and you can see them on the left. The state is very interested in supporting principals and supporting autonomy, and like many Midwestern states in the US in particular, there is a very, very strong tradition of local control. There is almost a resentment in many cases of mandates or edicts coming from the state capital. And so how to support principals' autonomy, how to be sensitive to their unique contexts while providing structure and accountability to new standards is quite complicated. And so we're having a lot of discussions about the common challenges related to autonomy, related to decision-making across urban, rural, and suburban settings. The new state standards are much more specific in terms of outcomes, much more specific in terms of behaviors from principals. The new standards also have a much clearer focus on equity, access, and inclusion, and much greater sensitivity to diversity. That is a front and center issue in many communities with heterogeneous students and families. And it's a different issue in settings, particularly in rural areas that are much more homogeneous. The autonomy, as Professor TIAN mentioned, is very different in terms of returning after the COVID-19 pandemic. Many districts wore masks and mandated masks. Many changed operations very little. And as many know in the US, the response to the pandemic was quite politicized, which made for much more autonomy and also complexity for those school leaders. And finally, the emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion that I mentioned. I was struck by a comment that Professor TIAN shared in her presentation about bewilderment. And I know many principals felt bewildered during the pandemic because of so many changes in the yo-yo and the on and off changes in formats. And I feel like that was particularly challenging, again, for our rural leaders who are geographically and positionally isolated. I also recall in a focus group, one of the principals saying to me, I should be better at my work than I am, and I've been doing this 20 years, but the role has changed so much from what I was prepared to do. And so a lot of our conversation and efforts going forward are around the right types of supports at the right time so that autonomy does not mean isolation and lack of access, but the right scaffolded supports, the right access to professional development and other resources. A final thought was that always rings in my head, a very autonomous principle shared in the qualitative research. I'm the only administrator, so I consult myself. And we know that school leadership can be lonely, but we also know that that degree of isolation is very perilous and does not serve leaders or students well. And so as we think about autonomy and the right levels of support, trying to be very mindful of those folks so they're not out alone, bewildered, and only consulting themselves. I am very happy to have the chance to share this work with you and learn from my distinguished colleagues and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pace. Great insight about the research conducted in the state of Nebraska. And now our next presenters are Dr. MUAHAYIMANA and Dr. SCHARES. The mic is yours.
Yes, good morning. Well, it's morning for us. I heard earlier, good afternoon, but morning for us. We are delighted to be here with you and to learn from you and to learn with you. It's, I think, kind of interesting. We're going to be the final leg, and I think we can make a lot of connections to our other two esteemed panelists. So I'm Denise SCHARES, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Northern Iowa in educational leadership, primarily supporting superintendent candidates, but also working with our principal candidates with an international group, and currently facilitating a grant from the Kern Family Foundation called Leading and Learning with Character. So I'll let Theo introduce himself, and then we'll dig into the slides. Theo, you're muted. There we go.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Theophile MUAHAYIMANA, assistant professor at University of Northern Iowa. And I teach primarily in the principalship program and in the international teacher leadership program. So Denise SCHARES is my colleague. Glad to be here.
I'm going to start out with the first few slides, which is really kind of an overview of the work we've been doing with the grant. And then Theo will go into, excuse me, to the research project that we're conducting relative to the work. So if you want to move to the next slide, thanks, Theo. The grant that we received from the Kern Family Foundation is the first grant of 2 that we've received. The one that we'll talk mostly about this morning is called Leading and Learning with Character, Developing Iowa's Educational Leaders. And it was right at $700,000 that we received for a 4-year grant. The grant has just been renewed for a second round, the full project about $3 million for another 5 years. So we're very excited, not only about the work that we've engaged in thus far, but the work we have opportunity to engage in the future. I mean, it really, as I said, kind of pulls in some of the major concepts that others have shared, because it focuses on the engagement of rural leaders in educational networks of practice. And just yesterday and the day before, I was with a group in a leadership camp, the primary activity that we'll talk about today. And they spoke of how delightful it was to be back together, to collaborate, to really talk about practice and engage in effective professional development opportunities. We too have a new set of standards, leadership standards. We're going from 6 to 10 and talked a great deal about, so what does that really mean to us as a state and to leaders? It really, the grant has really significantly helped us increase the capacity to serve. I direct the Institute for Educational Leadership, and we've for many, many years provided professional learning opportunities across the state, but we've really increased the capacity to do that. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. You can see there the outcomes. And again, I think it's so interesting how it just ties into what others have said. In Iowa, too, we have a great deal of both geographic and positional isolation that we're working to address. The leadership standards, along with the school board standards, we're really focusing on ethical leadership. How do you serve in a way that's fair, with integrity, and really model ethics and character in your work? Our work with school leaders has been just amazing for us. We've just gotten a lot of feedback. We have an outside evaluator that's helping us to collect data, but also working with school boards has been really interesting, kind of as a main leadership group. And oftentimes they don't consider the impact of their role. They're in the state of Iowa, they're volunteer servants for the district, critical role. And we have great dialogue with them about the importance of that. You'll also see that we work with some mentors, and we really are focusing on not only reflective practices, but that self-efficacy. So you can see here kind of some interesting thoughts for us. Pre-COVID, we were face-to-face. So we've, and you can see the numbers there. I won't go through those and some of the data that we collected. During the pandemic, we actually took the whole leadership camp process, which is a 2-day, 15-hour, 1 credit. Participants can earn 1 graduate credit from the University of Northern Iowa. We took the whole experience online. So recorded modules, which wasn't really my favorite way to present, because you know how you get the energy from being face-to-face with people, but people were so appreciative that even in a time of isolation, they could access professional development. And they spoke very, very highly and with great appreciation for us moving that work online so that it could be accessed even when we couldn't be together. We have just transitioned back. In fact, last week, this week, and next week, we are hosting leadership camps each week across the state. So Nick showed kind of the United States and Nebraska context, but it's kind of interesting because this past week, we were in Bettendorf, which is on the Illinois border to the far east. And next week, we're in Sioux City, which is the far west, not far from you, Nick, actually. So we're going across the state and working to reach leaders in all areas of the state.
All right, thank you, Denise, for setting the tone and sharing the background information to the study that we'd like to share, to talk about today. And like Denise has just mentioned, the Institute for Educational Leadership was fortunate to get the grant that helped in providing support to organize and lead these professional learning opportunities for school leaders. And when we talk of school leaders here, it's not just the principals. We focus or include different school leaders, namely principals, assistant principals, superintendents, and board members, just to make sure that we send the same message, because it's not just the principals who contribute to school improvement, but the other stakeholders who are involved. So when we talk of school leaders, not just think about the principals. So these professional learning opportunities kind of cover different areas, but for this specific ongoing study, we would like to focus on leadership camps. And like Denise mentioned, there are different periods, the pre-COVID, during the pandemic, and it is a kind of slow and hopefully short transition back to the normalcy. So our focus of the data that we like to discuss focused on pre-COVID leadership camps. And like, again, like I mentioned, we collected a lot of data. So we couldn't focus on that, all of that data for this specific study. We said, okay, let's now focus on plus data feedback. But not all the plus data feedback. Again, we tried to have a laser-like focus on plus aspects, which is about positive understanding, positive perceptions of school leaders in terms of the benefits that they thought they gained from leadership camps they've been involved in. So in terms of purpose and study of the study and its significance, like I've just mentioned, we wanted to get insight information about leaders' perceptions, their feelings of benefits they gained from the leadership camps. So what did you learn? What did you gain? Not just for you in terms of school leaders, but how are you going to apply the knowledge, those skills, those best practices when you go back to your schools and help those in your care? So that was the aim of the study. And in terms of objectives, like Dr. Pacey has mentioned and shares, it was about reducing perceived geographical and positional isolation, and mainly for school leaders coming from rural areas. Because looking at the data, we found out that 42% of participants came from rural areas. And of course, when you look at the data, even though we couldn't be specific and say, hey, this is information coming from principals or superintendents coming from rural areas, but you could tell from the content of their responses that they were very appreciative of getting this opportunity to come together and learn from one another, and kind of saying that kind of isolated to some extent. So that was the first objective of the study, to kind of break isolation walls that separated school leaders so that they could come together and share knowledge, practices, and skills. The second objective, like Denise shared, was to help school leaders to improve the understanding of Iowa standards for school leaders, because this is the tool they use. First of all, for superintendents, when they come and see what principals do, they look at this set of standards. And the principals, those are the same set of standards they use, kind of self-assess to see how they perform and achieve their duties. And lastly, building school leaders' self-efficacy. What kind of tools, what kind of strategies do they need to be able to fulfill their duties successfully? So that was basically the goal and the aim of the ongoing study. And as we started looking at the data, these are the highlights of the findings, some key emerging themes. The first one was, as you can imagine, interaction and professional networking. So all school leaders were very appreciative that leadership camps were a great opportunity for them to come together, exchange these professional conversations so that, you know, one can know what others are doing in their schools. Otherwise, it was really hard before that because, you know, if someone lives or operates or works in a very remote area without a connection and communication with other school leaders, it was really hard to kind of have this opportunity to come together and learn from one another. And the second emerging theme was self-efficacy, which was, of course, with gaining this autonomy, because when a principal or when any school leader doesn't feel confident in what they are doing, it's really hard to have a positive influence on their teams. So self-efficacy was another theme that appeared to be really recurring in participants' responses. So they were happy that they could come together and gain new strategies, mainly in the evaluation process, because the focus of leadership camps was on standards 5, which is about ethical and professional behaviors of school leaders. And one of striking responses that was recurring throughout this theme was coaching conversations, which goes with classroom observation, walk through the evaluation process, because it's not about, as we all know, it's not about, you know, police investigation. When a school leader go and see a teacher in their classroom, it's about to see how well they do and help them improve the instructional practices. So this is coaching conversation. So in terms of telling the teacher, okay, explain to me, why did you do that? Why did you do that? How would you do better? So that actually the 5 whys come in again as another strategy. So it's not about a school leader kind of dictating the teacher what they're supposed to do, but rather listening to them and providing support, but based on what the teachers think they're best for them. And the last 2 emerging themes were, of course, better understanding of the standards, like I've just mentioned, because this is one of the tools that both principals and superintendents use, I would say, on a daily basis to make sure that principals are doing their job in an appropriate way. So it was a good opportunity to make sure that both school leaders at the building level and the school leaders at the district level understand the content and the application of those standards. And the focus being on standard 5, which is about ethics and the professional practices. And lastly, but not less important, is reflective practices, because, you know, you can get insight and support from different people, but it's always important as a leader to take time and think, do a self-assessment of your practices and say, hey, how am I doing? How can I keep improving? And of course, again, going back to the focus and the aim of the grant, how do I expand my collaboration and communication with, first of all, with my peers, school leaders, and the teachers? So briefly, those were major things that emerged. And as we keep delving into the data, 3 implications that we kind of see are emerging. The first one, of course, is for districts, school districts, and the state to create space and opportunities for school leaders to keep, you know, finding ways to collaborate and build this professional community. And secondly, yeah, actually it goes, the second recommendation, it goes hand in hand with the first one. It's about finding ways to keep breaking these isolation walls and bringing school leaders together and build that community of practice. And of course, there is a constant need of human, financial, and material resources to make these professional learning opportunities happen. Yeah, so this is what we, at this level of our study, these are the highlights of the findings. And as you can tell, there are some overlap with what other presenters have just mentioned. What I would say is that school leaders need this ongoing, continuous improvement, because if you are at your school, whether it's in rural or urban settings, you need to meet with your colleagues to learn and know what they are doing so that you can keep learning from one another and improve your practices. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're happy to take any question and keep sharing, because I like the platform where we come together and learn from one another and exchange knowledge and the best practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. SCHARES and Dr. MUAHAYIMANA, for sharing your research with us. Now it is time for our guests to ask questions. If there are any questions, it's time that you can forward your questions to the speakers. And I cannot hear, and I can't see any hands raised. Yeah. Interpreter, Torgoimas, are you going to say something or? No. I have actually a question to Dr. Pace. I was wondering, you mentioned in both, I think, the research, yours and Dr. SCHARES and MUAHAYIMANA's research seemed a mixed type research, if I didn't miss it. And I was wondering if they were two separate research conducted, but by obviously different researchers, but did at any time of the research, any part of the research, like the qualitative one, impacted the other portion? I mean, the design. How was the design of this mixed method? I was just wondering.
A very good question. They operated separately. The survey, I think 226 participants in the end, but they were separate projects operating independently, but trying to get a complete view of principles and the way they do their work.
Mm-hmm. Got you.
And on our side, it was solely qualitative. We didn't conduct a quantitative study. Yeah.
Okay, and this was, I assume, preliminary findings that you presented, still going on, I think, right?
Yeah, we're done with data collection. Now we are kind of finalizing our draft.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering how many research assistants do you have? And I think most the hardest part for me is the transcription of all this data, of this interviews, tons of interviews to transcribe. It's always to me, scary.
And we do have one graduate assistant currently that's assigned to us that helped a great deal with our thematic coding. Something we didn't mention is we also work with an external evaluator who is collecting a great deal of our quantitative data through a variety of, there's a pre and post survey that goes out when people are engaging in the leadership camp. Prior to COVID, there was also a survey to those served by that leader. So if it was a building principal, their teachers were surveyed, and it was a culture and climate and kind of a sense of the work in the building. If it was a superintendent, that survey went to their administrative team, their leadership team. And so we have an external evaluator that is helping with a great deal of that data as well. So kind of a twofold process going on here as well.
Thank you. And I was wondering also, for the qualitative data, are you using any kind of software like the Atlas or Nudist or other computerized data analyzers?
We are not. We currently are. We did everything with this current study by hand on a very large spreadsheet to identify the themes. We did some theme coding and with the support of our graduate assistant. I'm sorry, Nick.
Yeah, no, the same here. We have many students that use some of the qualitative software, and I guess I'm showing my age because I prefer the old-fashioned way, I guess. Professor Tian, I really appreciated your presentation, and I want to look at the Hero with 1,000 Faces book. And when you were describing some of the hero history or assumptions about leaders, I was remembering one of my favorite articles, and it's written by Meg Wheatley, and it's called From Hero to Host, Leadership in an Age of Complexity. Are you familiar with that at all?
Oh, thank you for the suggestion. Actually, I'm now intrigued to look for that article and read it. Yeah, I think that it's fascinating. All the three presentations we've had so far is about changing the narrative of instead of seeing leaders as all-knowing, all-capable heroes who save people from adversity, to a more realistic picture and expectation on leaders who can be sometimes professionally and geographically quite isolated from peers and who need support and understanding and resources to further develop them professionally. So I think that is a common kind of theme across the three presentations today. And thank you, Nick, for the suggestion. I'll definitely look for the article.
Yeah, you certainly don't need my help or direction for your work, but I was struck by the similarity of the pieces. And what made me think of it was that geographically, positionally isolated principal out on their own with no one to turn to, feeling like they need to single-handedly solve all of these problems, which is not possible and not sustainable.
Okay, so thank you all very much, and we really appreciate for all our international speakers, distinguished international speakers, and I think it's people reminded me that the other session is about to start, so we need to I think leave the room. Thank you very much for the participation and for those great insights that you have all provided to us.
Nick, somebody did ask you to repeat the Meg Wheatley reference in the Q&A. So maybe just say that quickly before we leave. Margaret Wheatley. You see it there? Okay, so he's giving us that in the chat.
Ömer Hocam, Denise ne dedi tam olarak anlayamadım.
I couldn't quite grasp what Denise said.
Paylaşmaya çalışıyor şimdi. Denise, maybe we can share the reference page on the full text book. So is it necessary to share now?
Or the article name, I think she mentioned.
Yeah, I think Nick replied. So thank you. I just didn't want us to miss that question in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I thank all the speakers, Nick Pace, Denise, and the Theo, and the TIAN. Thank you very much. And I will open the next session. And I really appreciate her speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay. Welcome, Duncan. Good to see you here. Your heart is open, but your voice is closed.
Oh, good to see you, Ibrahim, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay, it's a really big honor for us to host you